Imagine opening your pantry in 1932.
They're all right there, and they're all at your fingertips.
1 can of corn, 2 eggs, a wrinkled carrot. 6 hungry faces are waiting. How did our grandparents turn scraps like these into supper? 30 Depression-era side dishes did exactly that. Stick with me, and at dish 17, I'll reveal the 9-cent bake that kept my great-grandmother from pawning her wedding ring. Wartime Wiggle Jell-O, a 1942 kitchen where the icebox hums louder than the radio, and a tin of peaches from last week sits on the shelf like buried treasure. Your kids are begging for something sweet, and all you've got is 1 lonely packet of lemon gelatin, a shriveled carrot, and a trade-earned scoop of cottage cheese from next door. You boil the peach syrup like it owes you rent, stir in the gelatin, and let the steam fog your glasses. Grate half a carrot until your knuckles complain, fold it in with that soft, salty cheese, and pour the whole golden mess into a loaf pan lined with wax paper peeled off a cereal box. Into the icebox it goes. No electricity guaranteed. You check it 3 times before bed. In the morning, it wobbles like a miracle. You dip a knife in hot water, slice clean squares, and lay them on lettuce, so limp it needs a reason to exist. 8 servings, 0 complaints. Kids clap like it's their birthday. Grown-ups nod because you just turned a can of peaches and a root vegetable into something that looks like celebration and costs less than a stamp. And if you ran out of syrup, tomato juice. Yep, you heard that right, tomato. Wartime gelatin forgave every culinary sin and turned pantry shame into Sunday best. Potato Peel Croquettes. It's Monday morning. Yesterday's supper barely scraped by, and the kitchen smells like coal dust and stubborn hope. In a chipped bowl float the forgotten curls of last night's potato peels, every skin saved like silver. The single mashed potato left on the plate, that's gold. You wring out the peels, chop them fine, and mash them into that cold leftover lump. Crack 1 egg, toss in onion powder if you're feeling fancy, or just shake in some pepper. The sticky mess becomes logs rolled in breadcrumbs from bread nobody liked. You drop them in hot bacon fat, and they hiss like they've got something to prove. They crisp, they brown, they puff, bite in, crispy shell, soft center, and the ghost of meat from the pan. 10 peels, 1 egg, and a potato you almost tossed? Now it's 4 bellies full and no one's asking what's missing. Bread and butter pickles. It's late May, and the garden's gone berserk. Cucumbers spill from the vines like they've got a vendetta. You haul in the basket, wash 'em quick, and start slicing, paper thin if your knife's sharp, chunky if your hands are tired. Onions, too, thick with tears and stronger than your rent. You salt the mountain and let it sweat. An hour later, rinse the tears off and pack the floppy coins into jars, still warm from boiling. In a pot, vinegar, sugar, a whisper of turmeric, and just enough salt to sting. It boils bright yellow and smells like sweet revenge. You pour the syrup over the cucumbers like liquid sun. Seal the jar, wipe your brow, and listen for that pop. 2 days later, snap, every bite summer in a bite. Sweet, tangy, bold. Wake up beans, dress cold greens, bribe a child. 12 jars from 1 basket. Corned beef hash patties, Saturday morning. Bacon fat hissed in a battered skillet while the house smelled like something good was coming. Finally, Mom cracked open a can of corned beef, 15 cents. Pricier than she'd like, but hunger didn't wait for sales. She mashed it into yesterday's cold potatoes, 2 cups, lumpy and stiff. Scraped the onion bits from the cutting board and tossed those in too. 1 egg from the coop went in for glue, and a generous shake of pepper if the shaker still had life. She shaped the mess into patties, round as palms and twice as heavy, floured both sides. Dropped them into the hot fat. They sizzled loud enough to call in the kids from outside. The bottoms crisped golden brown like autumn leaves, while the tops waited for their turn under the spatula. Flip once. Press gently. Serve with ketchup thinned out with vinegar to stretch the bottle another week. 6 patties. No one blinked at the missing meatloaf. Edges were lacy and sharp, middles soft and savory, the whole plate a trick played on the butcher's empty case. If potatoes ran out, leftover rice or even grated carrot bulked it up. No judgment. Kids fought over the crispiest edge. Grown-ups said nothing, just wiped the plates clean with heels of bread. That one tin stretched enough to fill the table and remind everyone that meat was still on the menu, even if it wasn't. Sunshine salad surprise, dessert that glows like stained glass. You'd never expect a side dish to look like a stained glass window, but Sunshine Salad Surprise wasn't just food, it was morale on a plate. Picture a cold January porch, wind snapping the laundry, and no fresh fruit in sight. Yet somehow, Grandma pulled sunshine from a tin and a packet. Start with 1 packet of orange gelatin, cheap and cheerful, and dissolve it in a cup of hot water. But don't stop there. Stir in half a cup of grated carrot, and half a cup of crushed pineapple, juice and all. Fold in a handful of marshmallows, miniature if you had them, chopped large if you didn't, and let the golden mixture cool to syrup. Pour it into any mold you could find, maybe the jelly pan from Christmas or a salvaged coffee can. Slide it into the icebox and wait. When it's set, you didn't just slice dessert, you served slices of sunlight. The carrots gave it crunch, the pineapple gave it zing, and the marshmallows melted into soft pearls. Kids swore it was candy from heaven. Grown-ups tasted vitamin C they couldn't afford. And when Grandma served it next to boiled potatoes or bland beans, it was like putting a smile on a gray plate. Dandelion Green Fritters. Before spinach came bagged or frozen, folks turned to their lawns for leafy greens. Dandelions weren't weeds, they were supper, vitamins, and pride, all rolled into one crispy fritter. You'd see barefoot kids racing through dewy grass with tin buckets swinging, hunting for young dandelion greens before the flowers popped. Back in the kitchen, Mom washed the leaves 3 times just to make sure no bugs came along for dinner. She'd chop the greens fine, mixing them with 1 beaten egg, a splash of milk, and enough flour to hold them together. A pinch of salt and pepper if payday was close, or just paprika for color if not. She dropped spoonfuls of batter into hot bacon fat, letting the fritters hiss and curl around the edges like autumn leaves in a skillet. They smelled earthy and toasty, like something stronger than weeds, like determination. Kids bit in suspiciously, then asked for seconds. The outside crackled, the inside melted, and nobody believed this came from the lawn. Served hot with vinegar or a squeeze of lemon if you had one, they filled stomachs and stories. Cost? Nothing but effort, but it fed 4 and made even the patchy yard feel like a grocery aisle. Peanut butter and onion sandwich. Lunch meat was a luxury in the 1930s, but in dusty schoolyards across America, this sharp little sandwich was passed around like contraband. 2 slices of day-old bread, a smear of peanut butter, and a paper-thin ring of raw onion. That was it, but together it hit like a diner plate with a $5 bill under it. Moms used what they had: bread from yesterday's loaf, peanut butter scraped from the bottom of the tin, onions sliced so fine they looked like lace. Sometimes a sprinkle of sugar got tossed in if the onion bite was too bold. Sugar was cheaper than ham. You'd press the slices together tight, so the peanut oil soaked into the bread, then tuck it into wax paper and send it off in a lunch pail. By noon, it was soft, pungent, and weirdly irresistible. Sweet, salty, sharp, like biting into confusion and loving every bite. At recess, kids traded them like baseball cards. 1 sandwich for 2 marbles, or half a peanut butter and onion for a bite of leftover cornbread. Nobody laughed, because hunger doesn't care what's normal. 3 cents fed a kid till dinner, and once you got past the surprise, it became a taste you chased, a little ugly, a little brilliant, like most depression tricks. War Garden Cabbage. Summers were hot, sweat dripped, and kitchens steamed, but a cast-iron skillet, a head of cabbage, and a little bacon grease could build miracles. War Garden Cabbage wasn't a fancy side. It was a declaration that flavor didn't cost a dime. Start with half a cabbage from the backyard patch. Shred it thin, like money you didn't have. Toss it into a skillet with a spoon of bacon grease saved in a tin under the sink. Add 1 chopped onion if you were lucky, and let the heat turn everything golden around the edges. Then came the twist, a splash of vinegar and a pinch of sugar. That balance, the bite and the sweetness, woke up even the blandest main dish. The vinegar cut the grease, the sugar glazed the leaves, and suddenly a humble vegetable sang with flavor. The smell? Neighbors smelled supper 3 doors down. It carried out the windows and made kids ask, "What's for dinner?" Even when the answer was just cabbage and cornbread. 1 pot, 2 cents, 6 full bellies, and not a complaint in sight. They called it Victory Garden Cooking because it made even a hard season feel like a win. Sunshine Salad Redux. Need color when winter's gone gray? This wasn't the same sunshine salad from earlier. This version had its own story. No pineapple, just a packet of orange gelatin, a cup of hot water, and 1 grated carrot. Add sliced canned peaches if you were flush, or just the syrup if you weren't. Stir it together, pour it into a chipped mold, and leave it on the porch to chill while you snapped beans or patched overalls. When you unmolded it the next day, it shimmered. The carrot gave it crunch, the syrup gave it shine, and kids swore it tasted like orange soda, even if they'd never had one. It wasn't fancy, but it looked like hope. Want something sweeter? Potato candy balls. Leftover spud turning into candy. Believe it? By the time sugar rations hit hard, dessert felt like a memory. But some kitchens pulled candy out of leftovers like it was child's play. Take 1 cold potato from last night's stew, mash it smooth, start adding powdered sugar 1 spoonful at a time until the dough turns into soft fudge under your spoon. Spread it flat like pie dough. Then smear on peanut butter. Not much, just enough to swirl. Roll it up like a jelly roll and chill it tight. When you slice it, you get pinwheels of sugar and salt, creamy and soft. 12 pieces from 1 potato, and 6 cents of sugar turned into treats that made kids believe Santa had arrived early. Moms passed the recipe in whispers, and kids lined up for the last piece. They called it poor man's fudge, but the smiles said otherwise. Hungry for something hot and salty? Dish number 11 begins the second act. These 20 dishes prove that hard times couldn't stop creative cooks from feeding their families. Vinegar Pie. What happens when you can't afford lemons but still crave something tart and sweet? The winter of 1932 brought the kind of cold that made folks huddle close to their wood stoves, counting every stick of kindling. Kitchen windows stayed frosted for weeks, and mothers stirred their pots with extra care, knowing each ingredient was precious. White vinegar, sugar, flour, eggs, butter, water. Mix the vinegar with sugar until it dissolves and sparkles. Beat eggs into the mixture, watching them swirl like golden ribbons. Sift flour slowly, creating clouds of white dust that settle gently. Heat butter in a pan until it bubbles and smells nutty. Pour everything together and stir until smooth as silk. Bake until the top turns golden and the filling sets firm. This pie fed 8 people for the cost of what 1 lemon would have cost at the store. Tastes like sunshine in a pan, Grandma always said when she pulled it from the oven. Mrs. Henderson next door swore it was better than any fancy dessert she'd ever tasted. The tangy sweetness hit your tongue first, followed by a rich, creamy finish that made you forget all about missing lemons. But sometimes even vinegar ran low, and that's when creative cooks turned to something even simpler. Water bread. Can you really make bread with nothing but flour and water? The drought of 1934 had been going on for months, and even the simplest ingredients were running short. Dust settled on everything, including the last bits of flour in the bottom of the sack. Flour, water, salt, baking powder, lard, sugar. Combine flour and salt in a large bowl, mixing with firm strokes. Add water slowly, feeling the dough come together under your hands. Knead until smooth and elastic, hearing the soft slap against the counter. Mix in baking powder and watch tiny bubbles form. Work in lard until the dough feels tender and pliable. Shape into loaves and bake until golden brown. One batch made 4 small loaves that kept a family fed for 3 days straight. Better than store-bought, Papa would declare, slicing it thick for dinner. Little Tommy Miller ate 3 slices at once and asked for more every single time. The bread had a dense, satisfying texture that filled your stomach and stuck to your ribs for hours. When bread grew stale, smart cooks knew exactly what to do with those leftover pieces. Dandelion Greens? Why throw away what grows free in every yard come springtime? April mornings in 1935 meant children scattered across empty lots and backyards, gathering handfuls of the bright green leaves. Mothers watched from doorways, baskets ready for whatever nature provided. Dandelion greens, bacon fat, onion, vinegar, salt, water. Pick tender leaves early in the morning when they taste sweetest. Wash them thoroughly, scrubbing away all traces of dirt and grit. Chop onions fine and fry them in bacon fat until they smell heavenly. Add greens to the hot pan, listening to them sizzle and pop. Pour in vinegar and water, creating steam that rises like morning mist. Cook until wilted and tender, stirring gently. A whole mess of greens cost nothing but time and fed the whole family. "Free food tastes best," Mother used to say while we gathered them. The Johnsons picked so many they shared with 3 other families on the block. The cooked greens had a slightly bitter taste that paired perfectly with the smoky bacon fat and sharp vinegar. Speaking of wild foods, there was one tree that saved many families that year: Acorn flour pancakes. Who knew that oak trees could feed a family just like wheat fields? The fall of 1933 brought more acorns than anyone had seen in years, covering the ground like brown carpet. Children filled their pockets and mothers filled their aprons, knowing winter was coming. Acorn flour, regular flour, eggs, milk, salt, baking powder. Crack acorns carefully, removing every piece of shell and bitter skin. Grind the meat fine, creating a rich brown flour that smells nutty. Mix with regular flour to make the batter lighter and fluffier. Beat eggs until foamy, then stir them in gently. Add milk slowly, watching the batter become smooth and thick. Cook on a hot griddle until bubbles form on top. These pancakes stretched expensive flour twice as far as usual portions. "Tastes like the forest," Dad always said with a big grin. Mrs. Wilson made them every Saturday morning, and her kids never complained once. The pancakes had a deep, earthy flavor that was completely different from regular ones, but just as filling. But when acorns ran out, creative cooks turned to something even more unusual: newspaper bread. Could yesterday's headlines really help today's dinner stretch further? The harsh winter of 1936 had folks trying anything to make food last longer. Newspapers piled up in every kitchen, and someone discovered they could serve a purpose beyond reading. Flour, water, salt, yeast, sugar, newspaper. Mix flour and salt in a bowl, creating a foundation for the bread. Dissolve yeast in warm water, watching it bubble and foam with life. Add sugar to feed the yeast and make it work faster. Wrap the dough in clean newspaper sheets, tucking the edges tight. Let rise in a warm place, feeling the dough push against the paper. Bake until golden, and the newspaper peels away easily. The newspaper kept the dough moist and helped it rise better than expensive cloth. "Waste not, want not," Grandma would say, smoothing the paper carefully. Even the preacher's wife tried this method and swore by the results. The bread came out softer and more tender than regular loaves, with a slight hint of the paper's woody smell. When bread was handled, attention turned to making the most of available meat. Rabbit stew. What do you do when chicken costs too much but protein is needed? The rabbit population had grown thick in the woods behind town, and men with good aim could provide for their families. Kitchen windows steamed up as pots bubbled with whatever the hunters brought home. The autumn of 1934 brought perfect hunting weather, with crisp mornings that made tracking easier, and afternoons warm enough to clean the catch outdoors. Fathers taught their sons how to skin and prepare the meat, passing down skills that would keep families fed through the harsh winter months ahead. Rabbit meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, flour, water. Clean the rabbit carefully, removing all the fur and shot pieces, cut into chunks that fit nicely in the pot. Brown the meat slowly, letting it sizzle and smell wonderful. Add chopped vegetables, hearing them hit the hot oil with a satisfying hiss. Sprinkle flour over everything, stirring until it coats the meat. Pour in water and simmer until tender and thick. The secret was adding the vegetables in stages, with the potatoes going in first because they took longest to cook, followed by carrots and onions last to keep them from turning to mush. One rabbit fed a family of 6 with enough left for lunch tomorrow. Better than beef, Uncle Joe declared after his first spoonful. The Murphy kids ate every bit and asked if there was more cooking. The stew tasted rich and gamey, with tender meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Every family had their own special way of seasoning the stew, with some adding wild herbs found in the woods and others using precious spices saved from better times. Not everyone could hunt, but anyone could make the most of kitchen scraps. Potato peel soup. Why throw away the most nutritious part of the potato? The spring of 1937 brought new hope, but old habits of saving everything. Potato peels piled up in bowls, too valuable to waste when bellies stayed empty. Smart housewives knew that most of the vitamins lived right under the skin, making peels more nutritious than the white flesh inside. Children were taught to scrub potatoes extra clean so the peels could be saved for soup, turning what others called garbage into a meal that would keep them healthy and strong. Potato peels, onion, milk, butter, salt, pepper. Scrub potato peels clean, removing any eyes or dark spots that might taste bitter. Chop onion fine and cook in butter until soft and golden. Add clean peels to the pot, stirring until they smell earthy. Pour in milk slowly, creating a creamy base that coats everything. Season with salt and pepper, tasting as you go. Simmer until the peels soften and the soup thickens naturally. The trick was not to overcook the peels, which would make them tough and bitter instead of tender and sweet. This soup used what others threw away and still filled everyone up. Tastes like regular potato soup, Mother said with surprise in her voice. The neighbor children never knew they were eating scraps until years later. The soup had a smooth, creamy texture with little bits of peel that added interest to every spoonful. Some families added wild greens or leftover vegetables to make the soup heartier, creating a different flavor each time, but always satisfying and warm. Even simpler was the way families used every bit of available grain. Cornmeal mush. How can 3 simple ingredients fill a whole family's hungry stomachs? The grain elevator still had cornmeal when everything else ran short, and wise mothers knew how to make it stretch. Steam rose from countless pots as families gathered around tables set with simple bowls. The yellow cornmeal came from local farms where corn still grew despite the drought, and smart shoppers bought it by the sack because it lasted longer than wheat flour. Every morning brought the same ritual of stirring the pot, with mothers teaching daughters the proper way to add the meal without making lumps. Cornmeal, water, salt, butter, milk, sugar. Boil water in a heavy pot, adding salt for flavor. Pour cornmeal slowly, stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming. Cook until thick and creamy, listening to it bubble and pop. Add butter for richness, watching it melt into golden swirls. Pour in milk to make it smoother and more filling. Sweeten with sugar if any was available. The secret was using a wooden spoon and stirring in the same direction every time, which kept the mush smooth and prevented it from sticking to the bottom of the pot. 1 cup of cornmeal made enough mush to feed 8 people breakfast. Sticks to your ribs, Papa always said, patting his stomach with satisfaction. The Jenkins family ate it 3 times a day for a whole week. The mush had a smooth, creamy texture that was both comforting and filling, with a sweet corn taste that reminded everyone of better times. Children learned to eat it without complaint, knowing that a full belly was better than an empty one, no matter what was in the bowl. When mush grew boring, creative cooks found ways to dress it up. Fried mush cakes. What happens when yesterday's breakfast becomes today's special treat? The leftover mush from breakfast sat in the icebox, firm and ready for something new. Afternoon light streamed through kitchen windows as mothers planned supper with whatever they had. The cold mush had set up perfectly overnight, becoming firm enough to slice without crumbling apart. Children who had grown tired of eating plain mush suddenly perked up when they smelled these cakes frying, proving that a little creativity could make even the simplest food seem special again. Leftover mush, flour, eggs, milk, salt, oil. Slice cold mush into thick pieces, feeling how firm it became overnight. Dip each slice in flour, coating both sides evenly. Beat eggs with milk, creating a smooth mixture that clings well. Soak mush slices in the egg mixture, letting them absorb the liquid. Heat oil in a heavy skillet until it shimmers and smells hot. Fry until golden brown, listening to the satisfying crackle. The key was getting the oil hot enough to create a crispy crust while keeping the inside soft and creamy, which took practice and patience. These cakes turned one breakfast into 2 different meals without extra cost. Like eating cake for supper, the children would giggle with delight. Mrs. Patterson served them with molasses and called them fancy griddle cakes. The outside was crispy and golden, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, making every bite a perfect contrast. Some families served them with honey when they could afford it, or sprinkled them with cinnamon sugar saved from better times. But the most creative dish of all required nothing more than determination. Victory Garden Soup. Could a handful of vegetables really taste better than store-bought ingredients? The summer of 1938 brought gardens full of whatever seeds folks could find, and every family tended their plots like precious treasure. Kitchen tables displayed the colorful harvest that meant survival through another winter. Tomatoes, green beans, carrots, onions, cabbage, water. Pick vegetables at their peak when they smell fresh and feel firm. Chop everything into bite-sized pieces, making them cook evenly. Start with onions, letting them soften and smell sweet in the pot. Add harder vegetables first, giving them time to become tender. Pour in water to cover, bringing everything to a rolling boil. Simmer until all vegetables blend together in perfect harmony. This soup cost nothing but seeds and sweat, yet fed the family for days. Better than any restaurant, Dad proclaimed, raising his spoon like a toast. The whole neighborhood could smell it cooking and came by to ask for the recipe. The soup tasted like summer sunshine in a bowl, with each vegetable contributing its own special flavor to the perfect blend. These 20 dishes prove that hard times couldn't stop creative cooks from feeding their families. These 20 dishes prove that hard times couldn't stop creative cooks from feeding their families. Molasses Cookies. What magic happens when you mix the last drops of molasses with whatever's left in the pantry? The December wind of 1934 rattled the kitchen windows while Mrs. Thompson rolled cookie dough on her worn wooden board. Her 3 children pressed their noses against the glass, watching snowflakes dance in the pale afternoon light. The house smelled like cinnamon and hope, even though the larder was nearly empty. Molasses, flour, butter, baking soda, ginger, salt, sugar. These cookies will have to last us until Papa gets paid on Friday, she whispered to herself. Pour molasses into a bowl, watching it flow like dark honey. Mix flour and salt together, creating a foundation that smells clean and fresh. Cream butter with sugar until light, feeling the mixture become fluffy under your hands. Add molasses slowly, hearing it blend with a satisfying swoosh. Stir in dry ingredients, watching the dough come together in rich brown swirls. Shape into balls and bake until they smell spicy and wonderful. One batch of cookies made enough treats to last the whole week and cost less than a nickel. Old Mr. Jenkins, next door, traded 3 eggs for a dozen cookies because his wife loved them so much. The cookies had a chewy texture that stuck to your teeth in the most delightful way, with warm spices that made your whole mouth tingle. Like those Victory Garden vegetables, these cookies proved simple ingredients could create something special, But even sweeter treats awaited. Bread pudding. How do you turn yesterday's stale bread into today's most requested dessert? The spring morning of 1935 found Sarah cleaning out her bread box, discovering 3 hard loaves that nobody wanted to eat. Her husband sat at the kitchen table, mending his work shirt while the radio played soft music. Outside, the first green shoots of grass were pushing through the last patches of snow. Stale bread, milk, eggs, sugar, vanilla, butter, raisins. "Don't you dare throw that bread away, honey. I've got plans for it," Mom said with a smile. Ear bread into small pieces, feeling how dry and rough it has become. Soak in warm milk, watching the bread absorb every precious drop. Beat eggs with sugar until they look pale and taste sweet. Add vanilla slowly, smelling its rich perfume fill the kitchen air. Mix everything together gently, hearing the soft squish of soaked bread. Dot with butter and sprinkle raisins on top, then bake until golden and firm. This pudding transformed worthless bread into a dessert that satisfied 6 people completely. When the preacher came calling, he asked for the recipe and said it reminded him of his childhood home. Pudding was warm and creamy inside, with a golden crust on top that crackled when you pressed your spoon against it. Just like those fried mush cakes, this dish proved leftovers could become something even better, though soup was calling next. Bean and ham bone soup. Why waste a single morsel when one ham bone can feed a family for 3 days running? Cold February evening of 1936 brought Mrs. Anderson to her kitchen, where the ham bone from Sunday dinner sat waiting in the icebox. Her husband sat by the fireplace, reading the newspaper aloud, while their twins played quietly with wooden blocks. The wind howled outside, making everyone grateful for the warmth inside. Ham bone, navy beans, onion, carrots, celery, water, salt. "That bone's got plenty of good eating left on it," her husband called from the parlor. Soak beans overnight, watching them plump up like little white pillows. Place ham bone in a large pot, hearing the gentle bubble and pop of cooking. Stir occasionally, watching the beans soften and the broth grow rich and thick. Season with salt when the flavors have had time to blend perfectly. 1 ham bone and a cup of beans made enough soup to feed the family for 3 full days. Little Mary Peterson from across the street always showed up around dinner time, hoping for a bowl to take home. Soup was thick and hearty, with tender beans that melted in your mouth and bits of ham that tasted like Sunday dinner all over again. Like that rabbit stew, this soup proved protein could stretch far, but breakfast was demanding attention too. Oatmeal cookies. What happens when you need cookies but the cupboard holds nothing but oats and hope? A warm May afternoon of 1937 found Emma mixing dough while her baby napped in the wooden cradle nearby. Her older son sat on the porch steps, whittling a toy boat from a piece of scrap wood. The apple tree outside the kitchen window was covered in pink blossoms that danced in the gentle breeze. Oats, flour, butter, brown sugar, eggs, baking soda, cinnamon. "Mama, can we have cookies after supper?" little Bobby asked through the screen door. Mix oats with flour, creating a texture that looks rough and feels hearty. Cream butter with brown sugar until light, smelling the rich molasses sweetness rise up. Beat in eggs one at a time, watching them disappear into the creamy mixture. Add dry ingredients slowly, feeling the dough become thick and chunky. Stir in cinnamon, breathing in the warm spice that smells like autumn mornings. Drop spoonfuls onto a baking sheet and bake until golden brown around the edges. These cookies used cheap oats to make treats that lasted longer than expensive store-bought ones. The Miller family traded fresh milk for cookies because their cow had stopped giving and they missed having sweets. Cookies were chewy and substantial, with a nutty flavor that made you feel full and satisfied after just 1 or 2. Like those molasses cookies, these proved simple could be special, but supper still needed something more filling. Potato soup. How can 1 sack of potatoes become a week's worth of warm, filling meals? The snowy January morning of 1938 brought Margaret to her kitchen early, where a bag of potatoes sat on the counter like a promise. Her husband was already dressed for work, stamping his feet to warm them before heading out to the factory. The children slept upstairs, their breath visible in the cold air of the unheated bedrooms. The potatoes had been a gift from her brother's farm, 20 pounds of russets that would have cost more than they could spare at the market. Each one was perfectly shaped, their brown skins rough but clean, carrying the earthy smell of the fields where they'd grown. Margaret had learned to see potential in every ingredient, to stretch and transform simple foods into sustenance that could carry a family through the hardest times. Potatoes, milk, butter, onion, flour, salt, pepper. "Make it thick, honey. We'll need something that sticks to our ribs today," he said while pulling on his coat, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid kitchen air. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake adding to the blanket that would make his walk to the factory treacherous but necessary. The kitchen stove had been burning since 4 in the morning, its warmth the only thing that made the room bearable. Margaret had risen early, as she always did, to stoke the fire and prepare for the day ahead. The routine had become second nature. Check the firebox, add coal if they could spare it, wood if they couldn't, and set the kettle to boil for the morning's needs. Peel potatoes carefully, saving every scrap of flesh and feeling their smooth weight in your hands. The peeler had been her mother's, its wooden handle worn smooth by countless meals prepared in kitchens much like this one. Each potato revealed its creamy interior, the flesh firm and promising. Even the peels wouldn't be wasted. They'd be saved for the chickens or boiled into a thin broth for tomorrow's soup. Dice onion fine, listening to the sharp sound of the knife hitting the cutting board. The onion had been pulled from the root cellar, one of the last from the previous autumn's harvest. Its layers were still firm and sweet, releasing their pungent aroma that would soon transform into something altogether more comforting. Margaret's eyes watered slightly, but she'd learned to work through the tears, just as she'd learned to work through everything else. Cook onion in butter until soft, smelling the sweet aroma that fills the kitchen. The butter was precious, a small pat saved from the week's ration, hoarded for just such a moment when it could transform simple ingredients into something memorable. It sizzled and foamed in the heavy iron pot, the sound promising richness and warmth. The onion began to soften, its sharp edges mellowing into sweetness. Add potatoes and water, watching them bob like little boats in the pot. The water came from the pump outside, cold and clear, carrying with it the minerals that would help draw out the starch from the potatoes. Each piece of potato floated briefly before settling into the depths of the pot, where they would slowly give up their substance to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Simmer until tender, hearing the gentle bubbling that means they're almost ready. The sound was hypnotic, a steady rhythm that spoke of patience and care. Margaret stood watch, occasionally stirring with a wooden spoon that had seen 1,000 meals, its surface smooth and darkened with age. The kitchen filled with the earthy aroma of cooking potatoes, a smell that would soon call the children down from their beds. Mash some potatoes for thickness, leaving chunks for texture, then stir in milk and seasonings. The milk had been diluted slightly, half milk, half water, to make it stretch further, but it still added the richness that would make this soup memorable. The masher worked through the tender potatoes, some yielding completely to become part of the creamy base, others maintaining their shape to provide substance with each spoonful. One bag of potatoes made enough soup to feed the family for 5 days straight. When the Hendersons lost their jobs, Margaret sent over a pot of soup that kept them going until things improved. The gesture wasn't unusual. Neighbors helped neighbors, understanding that today's kindness might be tomorrow's necessity. The soup traveled wrapped in dish towels, still steaming when it reached the Hendersons' door. The soup was creamy and warming with chunks of potato that melted on your tongue and left you feeling satisfied and full. It was simple food made extraordinary by necessity and love, each bowl containing not just nutrition, but comfort. The children would come to the table with cold hands and leave with warmth spreading through their bodies, ready to face whatever the day might bring. Like that potato peel soup, this proved potatoes could save the day, but something sweet was needed for morale. Apple Brown Betty. What do you do when the apples are getting soft, but throwing them away feels like a sin? The crisp October evening of 1933 found Ruth in her kitchen, sorting through a basket of apples that were past their prime. Her mother-in-law sat at the table, snapping green beans, while the two women talked about the harvest. The setting sun cast long shadows through the window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The apples had come from the old tree behind the house, the one that had been planted when Ruth's husband was just a boy. It was a reliable producer, year after year, dropping its fruit in the yard with a generosity that seemed almost defiant in these lean times. Most of the apples had been stored in the root cellar, wrapped in newspaper and bedded in straw, but these had been overlooked and were now showing their age. Ruth's mother-in-law, a woman who had lived through the hard times that followed the Great War, believed deeply in the sin of waste. "A penny saved is a penny earned," she would say. But more than that, she understood that everything had value, even things that others might discard. Her weathered hands moved efficiently through the green beans, snapping them with the rhythm of long practice. Apples, breadcrumbs, butter, sugar, cinnamon, lemon juice, water. "Those apples may be soft, but they'll make the finest dessert you ever tasted," Grandma said knowingly. She had seen hard times before, had learned to transform the overlooked and forgotten into something precious. Her voice carried the certainty of experience, the confidence that comes from years of making do and making magic from scraps. The breadcrumbs had been prepared over the course of the week, every heel and crust carefully saved and dried before being ground into fine crumbs. Nothing was wasted in this kitchen. Even the stalest bread found new purpose. The sugar was precious, doled out carefully from the small bag in the pantry, each grain precious as gold. Peel apples carefully, removing brown spots and feeling their soft flesh give under your fingers. The peeling knife was sharp and familiar, worn to fit Ruth's hand perfectly. Each apple revealed its secrets. Some were still firm beneath their softening skin, others were completely tender throughout. The brown spots were carefully cut away, but the rest of the fruit was perfectly good, sweet and fragrant with the concentrated flavor that comes with age. Slice them thin, hearing the wet sound of the knife cutting through. The slices fell into neat piles, their surfaces already beginning to brown in the evening air. Each piece was cut with care, uniform in thickness, so they would cook evenly. The apple juice ran onto the cutting board, sticky and sweet, a preview of the dessert to come. Toss with sugar and cinnamon, watching the spices coat each piece evenly. The cinnamon was a luxury, carefully measured from the small tin that lived in the spice cabinet. Its warm aroma promised comfort and celebration, transforming simple apples into something festive. The sugar began to draw out the juices, creating a syrup that would caramelize in the oven's heat. Layer apples with breadcrumbs, smelling the sweet mixture that promises good things to come. The breadcrumbs were scattered between layers of apple, creating texture and substance. They would absorb the apple juices as the dessert baked, becoming tender and flavorful. The layering was done with care, each level building on the last, to create a dessert that would be both beautiful and satisfying. Dot with butter and sprinkle with lemon juice, then add water to prevent burning. The butter was the final luxury, small pats distributed across the surface like golden promises. The lemon juice, squeezed from a precious lemon saved for just such occasions, would prevent the apples from browning further and add a bright note to balance the sweetness. Bake until golden and bubbly, listening to it sizzle in the oven. The old stove held steady heat, its iron walls radiating warmth throughout the kitchen. The sound of the dessert cooking was musical, the gentle bubbling of apple juices, the soft crackle of browning crumbs. The aroma filled the house, drawing the family toward the kitchen with the promise of something special. This dessert used apples that would have been wasted and fed 8 people for almost nothing. The church ladies all asked for the recipe when Ruth brought it to the harvest supper last fall. The dessert was warm and comforting, with tender apples that tasted like concentrated autumn and crispy crumbs that added perfect texture. Like those acorn flour pancakes, this dish used what nature provided, but hearty fare was still needed. Corn fritters. How can a few ears of corn become golden treasures that disappear as fast as you can fry them? The humid August morning of 1935 brought Alice to her kitchen, where 6 ears of corn sat on the counter, their kernels plump and milky. Her husband was already in the fields, and the children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying through the open windows. The air was thick with the promise of another hot day ahead. The corn had been picked at dawn, pulled from the stalks, while the morning dew still clung to the husks. Alice had learned from her grandmother that corn was best used immediately after picking, when the sugars hadn't yet turned to starch and the kernels burst with sweet juice. The ears were perfectly formed, their silk still fresh, and their husks bright green, speaking of the garden's generous abundance. The morning ritual of corn preparation was almost ceremonial. Alice would sit on the back steps, a large bowl in her lap, and carefully peel back the husks, removing every strand of silk with patient fingers. The children would often join her, their small hands helping to clean the ears while they chattered about their plans for the day. Corn kernels, flour, eggs, milk, baking powder, salt, oil. "Save some of those fritters for me," her husband had said before heading out to work, his words carrying the weight of anticipation. He knew the magic that happened when Alice worked with fresh corn, how she could transform simple ingredients into something that tasted like sunshine and summer mornings. The kitchen was already warm from the morning sun streaming through the windows, and the prospect of frying made Alice consider opening more windows to catch any breeze that might stir. But the reward would be worth the heat. Golden fritters that would make the family forget, for a moment, the hardships that shadowed their days. Cut corn kernels from cobs, feeling the sharp knife slice through and hearing them drop into the bowl. The knife moved in steady strokes, each cut releasing a small spray of milky juice. The kernels fell like pale golden jewels, some whole and perfect, others broken and releasing their sweet contents. The bare cobs would be saved for the chickens, nothing wasted in this careful household. Mix flour with baking powder, creating a foundation that smells clean and fresh. The flour was precious, sifted carefully to remove any lumps that might create texture problems in the final product. The baking powder was newer, a modern convenience that had revolutionized home cooking, allowing for light and airy results that would have been impossible with just flour and eggs. Beat eggs with milk until frothy, watching them become light and airy. The eggs had come from their own chickens, the shells still warm when Alice collected them that morning. The milk was fresh, cooled in the spring house and still sweet. The beating was done by hand, with a fork that had seen countless meals, the rhythm steady and practiced. Combine wet and dry ingredients, stirring until just mixed and slightly lumpy. The batter came together quickly, the flour hydrating and the baking powder already beginning to work its magic. Alice knew not to overmix. A few lumps were preferable to tough fritters. The corn kernels were waiting, ready to be folded in with gentle hands. Fold in corn kernels gently, seeing them distribute throughout the golden batter. Each kernel was a burst of flavor waiting to happen, suspended in the tender batter like stars in a golden sky. The mixture was thick enough to hold its shape, but light enough to fry into delicate, crispy morsels. Heat oil until it shimmers, then drop spoonfuls of batter and fry until crispy and brown. The oil was precious, saved bacon fat mixed with a little lard, heated until it danced in the pan. The first test spoonful sizzled and bubbled, turning golden almost immediately. The timing was crucial. Too hot, and the outside would burn before the inside cooked. Too cool, and the fritters would be greasy and heavy. These fritters turned 6 ears of corn into enough food to feed 10 people breakfast. The Johnson children always appeared at the back door when the smell of frying corn filled the air. The fritters were crispy outside and tender inside, with kernels that popped between your teeth and released their sweet, summery flavor. Like that cornmeal mush, corn proved its worth again, but something more substantial was calling. Cabbage Rolls. What magic happens when you wrap simple ingredients in the embrace of a cabbage leaf? The chilly March evening of 1936 brought Helen to her kitchen, where a large head of cabbage sat waiting like a green promise. Her sister sat at the table, helping roll the mixture while they talked about their children and worried about their husbands' jobs. The radio played softly in the background, mixing news with music that helped pass the time. The cabbage had been one of the last from the root cellar, stored through the winter months in the cool, dark space beneath the house. It was a massive head, tight and firm, its outer leaves showing only the slightest signs of the months it had spent in storage. Helen had learned to select the best cabbages for winter keeping, choosing those that were heaviest and most compact, with roots and stems intact. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, a refuge from the cold wind that rattled the windows. Helen's sister had arrived just as the afternoon light began to fade, bringing with her the latest news from her neighborhood and willing hands to help with the evening's cooking. The two women had developed a rhythm over the years, working together with the easy familiarity of shared experience. Cabbage, ground meat, rice, onion, tomato sauce, salt, pepper. "These rolls will stretch that little bit of meat into supper for all of us," Helen said hopefully. The meat was precious, just half a pound of ground beef from the butcher, purchased with careful consideration of the family budget, but Helen knew the secret of making a little go a long way, of transforming modest ingredients into a meal that would satisfy and nourish. The rice had been cooked earlier in the day, steamed until each grain was separate and tender. It would provide bulk and substance, absorbing the flavors of the meat and seasonings while making the filling more substantial. The onion had been diced fine, its sharp flavor ready to mellow and sweeten during the cooking process. Remove cabbage leaves carefully, feeling their weight and seeing their perfect cup shape. The technique required patience and practice. Too much force, and the leaves would tear. Too little, and they wouldn't separate from the core. Helen's hands moved with practiced skill, peeling away layer after layer of perfect green cups, each one destined to hold a portion of the precious filling. Blanch leaves in boiling water, watching them turn bright green and become pliable. The transformation was almost magical. The tough, crisp leaves softening and becoming flexible, their color brightening to an almost emerald green. The kitchen filled with the clean, slightly sweet aroma of cooking cabbage, a smell that spoke of comfort and home. Mix meat with cooked rice, hearing the grains separate and combine. The meat was still slightly warm, its fat beginning to congeal as it cooled. The rice absorbed the meat juices, taking on flavor and richness. Helen's hands worked the mixture gently, combining the ingredients without overworking the meat, which would make it tough and unappetizing. Add chopped onion and seasonings, smelling the mixture that promises good eating ahead. The onion added texture and flavor, its sharp bite balancing the richness of the meat. Salt and pepper were added with a careful hand. Seasonings were precious, and the tomato sauce would add its own flavor to the finished dish. Place filling in cabbage leaves, rolling them tight like little packages. Each leaf was spread flat, its thick stem trimmed to prevent tearing. A spoonful of filling was placed at the base, then the sides were folded in, and the leaf rolled tight, creating a neat package that would hold together during cooking. The rolling was meditative work, each cabbage roll a small gift wrapped in green. Arrange in a pot with tomato sauce and simmer until tender and fragrant. The rolls were nestled close together in the heavy pot, covered with tomato sauce that had been thinned with a little water. The cooking would be slow slow and gentle, allowing the flavors to meld and the cabbage to become completely tender, the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of the simmering dish, a smell that would draw the family to the table. These rolls turned half a pound of meat into dinner for 8 people with leftovers for lunch. Mrs. Patterson's Polish grandmother taught her this recipe, and now 3 generations made them together every Sunday. The rolls were tender and flavorful, with the cabbage adding a slight sweetness that perfectly balanced the savory meat and rice filling. Like that Dandelion Greens dish, cabbage proved vegetables could be the star, but something simple was needed next. Milk toast. How can bread and milk become a meal that comforts the soul and fills the belly? The quiet Sunday morning of 1937 found Dorothy preparing breakfast while her family slept late upstairs. The house was peaceful, with only the sound of the coffee pot percolating and the newspaper rustling in the breeze from the open window. Spring sunlight streamed across the kitchen table, promising a beautiful day ahead. Bread, milk, butter, salt, pepper, sugar, cinnamon. Sometimes the simplest things taste the best, her mother had always said about this dish. Toast bread until golden, feeling its warmth and hearing the satisfying crunch when you tap it. Heat milk gently, watching for the first tiny bubbles that mean it's ready. Butter the toast while hot, seeing it melt and soak into every corner. Pour warm milk over toast, listening to the soft sizzle as it meets the butter. Season with salt and pepper, or sugar and cinnamon for a sweet version. Serve immediately while everything is still warm and comforting. This simple meal used ingredients everyone had and satisfied hunger for just a few pennies. When little Jimmy was sick with a fever, milk toast was the only thing he could keep down. The dish was warm and soothing, with the bread soaking up the creamy milk and creating a texture that was both familiar and comforting. Like that water bread, this proved simple could satisfy, but one final dish would complete the journey. Vinegar candy. What happens when you take the last bit of sugar and turn it into something that makes children smile? The cold December evening of 1938 brought Mary to her kitchen, where she planned to make something special for her 3 children, despite having very little to work with. Her husband sat by the fire, reading to the children while they waited for their mother's surprise. The wind rattled the windows, but inside the house felt warm and full of anticipation. Sugar, vinegar, butter, baking soda, water, vanilla, salt. "Mama's making something special, so you children be patient," she called from the kitchen. "Combine sugar and vinegar in a heavy pan, stirring until the mixture looks clear and smooth. Add water and cook slowly, watching the syrup bubble and turn golden. Test in cold water, feeling when it forms hard threads that snap cleanly. Remove from heat and add butter, seeing it melt and swirl through the hot syrup. Stir in baking soda quickly, hearing it foam and bubble up dramatically. Add vanilla and pour onto a buttered pan, then break into pieces when cool. This candy used common ingredients to create treats that lasted for weeks and cost almost nothing. The neighbor children always knew when Mary was making candy because the sweet smell drifted through the whole neighborhood. The candy was hard and tangy, with a burst of sweetness that made your mouth water and left you wanting just one more piece. Like that first vinegar pie, this final dish proved that creativity and love could transform the simplest ingredients into something truly special. These recipes tell the story of American resilience, written in the language of kitchen wisdom and neighborhood kindness. Each dish represents more than mere sustenance. They are testimonies to the ingenuity of ordinary people who refuse to let hardship dim their humanity. In kitchens across the country, women like Margaret, Ruth, Alice, and Helen transformed scarcity into abundance, creating meals that nourished both body and spirit. Their legacy lives on in every pot of soup shared with a neighbor, every dessert made from overlooked ingredients, every creative solution that turns the humble into the extraordinary. These were the dishes that carried families through the darkest times, proving that love, expressed through food, can conquer any adversity. These 30 recipes tell the story of American resilience, written in the language of kitchen wisdom and neighborhood kindness. Each dish represents more than mere sustenance. They are testimonies to the ingenuity of ordinary people who refuse to let hardship dim their humanity. In kitchens across the country, women like Margaret, Ruth, Alice, and Helen transformed scarcity into abundance, creating meals that nourished both body and spirit. They turned potato peels into soup, dandelion greens into dinner, and stale bread into dessert. They made candy from vinegar, stretched 1 tin of corned beef to feed 6, and discovered that newspaper could help bread rise better than expensive cloth. These weren't just recipes, they were acts of love wrapped in practicality. When Mrs. Henderson lost her job, neighbors appeared with pots of bean soup. When the Johnson children smelled corn fritters frying, they knew they'd find welcome at a neighbor's table. Community wasn't just helpful, it was essential for survival. The magic wasn't in exotic ingredients or fancy techniques. It was in the refusal to give up, the determination to find joy in simple pleasures, and the wisdom to waste nothing. These cooks saw potential where others saw scraps. They understood that creativity could multiply resources and that sharing made everyone stronger. Their legacy lives on in every pot of soup shared with a neighbor, every dessert made from overlooked ingredients, every creative solution that turns the humble into the extraordinary. These were the dishes that carried families through the darkest times, proving that love, expressed through food, can conquer any adversity. Today, when we face our own challenges, these recipes remind us that abundance isn't about having everything. It's about making the most of what we have.